Hey, Pastor Brett here, and we come to Genesis chapters 31 through 40, where I want us to focus on the patriarch Isaac and a particular story in his journey, in his walk with the Lord. And that is found in chapter 32. Previously, we've looked at Abraham and how he was the father of our faith, justified by faith. We've looked at his son Isaac, that is Abraham's son Isaac, and previously looked at how Isaac was embracing his father's legacy, his father's faith. Now we come to Abraham's grandson, Isaac's son, Jacob. Now, Jacob was named appropriately. The word Jacob means supplanter. It gives the idea of deception. He's a layer of snares. Literally, the name Jacob means that. It's someone who sets to deceive, to manipulate circumstances in order to get their way. And that's what we see happening in Jacob's life. He's been operating out of the flesh, but he's been operating out of the flesh and deceiving in order to get his way. It caused a great rift between he and his brother Esau, and his brother Esau wanted to kill him. And so he fled, and he ended up going back to the area where his family had originally come from, that God had called them out of in order to come to the promised land. So he goes back to that land. His uncle Laban then provides for him and provides a wife as well. And we've got this incredible story of Rachel and Leah. And now, after he's worked there for a couple of decades for his father-in-law, and he's prospered in the land, he takes all that he owns, and he takes his wife, his wives, and his children, and all their servants, and they leave Laban secretly to escape him, because Laban didn't seem to want to let him go. And now they're returning to the promised land. God had told him to go back. And so he's going back. And so he has to flee from Laban. Laban chases him down, but God gives Jacob favor, and he's able to escape from Laban, and they're able to move on, and they make this agreement, this treaty, that neither one of them is going to pass over one way or another. It's kind of sad when you think about it. A father-in-law and him are at such odds that they can't even cross over to see each other. And now he's headed back, and then he gets word that his brother Esau is coming after him, or not after him, but is galloping along with 400 other men. Picture them on swords and horses and galloping toward him. Esau wanted to kill him. That's why he left to begin with. Now he's coming back 2 decades later, and he's nervous. Is his brother going to receive him or not? Is he going to accept him or not? And as he's about to enter into the promised land, he's worried about his brother. So he resorts again to his scheming. That's his default pattern. He schemes. And so he schemes by sending all these gifts ahead. And in the midst of that, in chapter 32, he does pray. He does something right. Amidst his scheming, he also does something right. Now, isn't that so much like us, all of us? Even those of us who like to think we're right with the Lord and walking with him, we gravitate between lacking faith and trusting God in how he said he's going to provide for us, as God had said to Jacob, and then wanting to manipulate the circumstances ourselves and take control of the circumstances to protect ourselves. So we vacillate between faith and unbelief. Well, here he's in a better moment of his. He's praying to God in Genesis 32, verses 9 and following. Then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. That's a good start. Then verse 10, I'm unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I've become 2 groups. He had divided his group into all his people into 2 groups, so that if the 400 were attacked and demolish one, at least one of them would be able to escape. So that's what he's making reference there to. And this again, he's humbling himself before the Lord. He's seeing the reality that God's been the reason why he's been successful. So this is good. This is good prayer. Humbling himself before the Lord, acknowledging his unworthiness, acknowledging that God is the one who's provided for him. Save me. Verse 11, again, a wonderful prayer. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I'm afraid. He acknowledges his weakness. He acknowledges his fear. For I'm afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. He'll attack them. But you've said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. This is what you've promised me, Lord, so I need you to come through, because I'm very scared right now. I'm afraid of my brother. This is like us, isn't it? We walk in faith, wanting to cling to the promises of God and yet also walk in fear, and we vacillate between the two? The Bible goes on to say, verses 13 and following, that he spends the night there. But I want to skip on down to verse 22. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maid servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men, and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Fascinating story. My subtitle in my Bible actually says, Jacob wrestles with God. This was perhaps an angel as a messenger from the Lord, representing the Lord, an ambassador for the Lord, if you will. Perhaps it was Jesus, a pre-incarnate appearance of the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ. A lot of people think that this is Christ appearing to Jacob. Whether it was an angel or whether it was Jesus, Jacob interprets this as I wrestled with God. It's fascinating here in this passage, a few things. First of all, it's very fascinating in and of itself, just the fact that he had this wrestling match with God, which is symbolic for us of how we are to bring our fears and our concerns, which he'd done previously in that prayer, but it also is symbolic of how God comes to us, and he puts us in a position to where we have to submit to him, puts us in a position where we recognize we have to have his blessing. He puts us on our back. Now, think of this for a moment. There is no way that a human being could wrestle with God. The finite against the infinite. The limited in power against the almighty, all-powerful God. So it would be impossible for someone to actually wrestle God with God and win. And yet God says, you have prevailed. What was his prevailing? His prevailing was his perseverance. His prevailing was his desiring the blessing, recognizing he needed the blessing of God in his life. He needed to reach a point where God was prevailing over him to such a degree that he knew he had to have God's blessing, which results in him having the victory. Here's the real spiritual key. We cannot do it in our own strength. Up to this point in his life, Jacob had been doing everything in his, it seems like everything almost in his own strength. And where had that led him? That had led him to be far away from home. And yet God still blessed him and provided for him. But then he reaches a point where now he's having to go home, and he's very, very afraid. What's going to happen to him? Jacob needed the Lord's blessing in his life, but he had to wrestle that. He had to go to God in prayer and wrestle with him. He went to God in prayer, and then God met with him. He met with God, and then God met with him. God responds to us. Draw near to God, the Bible says, and he will draw near to you. And he may draw near to us in a way that we don't expect, like an intruder in the night, and wrestling with us. Who knows how long it took for Jacob to realize he wasn't wrestling with an ordinary man, but this was God visiting with him, wrestling with him, helping him rid himself of his self-sufficiency. From then on, he walked with a limp. God touched him, put weakness in his life so that he would recognize that his strength was truly in God and not in his own scheming. I want to give you a quote here that I thought was excellent on this point. Derek Prince writes, As long as we trust in our own strength, ability, and cleverness, we remain as Jacob was. We will struggle and strive, but we will not get what God has appointed for us. But when we have a limp, when we no longer walk in our own strength, the way is open for us to walk back into our inheritance. When Jacob did this, he had the blessing of not merely his father, but also of God. If you come to a point in your life where God has touched you, put some weakness in your life, some obvious weakness to where you depend on him, you're in the best position when you're depending on him. And unfortunately, for so many of us, we don't depend on him until we're weakened. Has God taken you onto the mat and wrestled with you and pinned you in such a way that you have learned to depend on him? One of the interesting parts of this dialogue that the Lord has with Jacob is he asks what his name was. It's not that God didn't know that. It's that God was reminding him of his sinful past. It's not something God enjoys doing, but he does it here to humble him and help him to recognize you cannot be what you've been in the past. I'm calling you to something higher. I'm calling you to something new. And so there's a sense in which God causes Jacob to step into his shame of his past, of his self-sufficiency, of his scheming, and acknowledge that that's what he's been. If we confess our sin to God, if we confess our sins, if we don't try to keep covering them up, God brings us mercy. And we see the mercy here. God says, I'm giving you a new name. Your name will be Israel, which means God prevails. God's prevailing in your life. He's going to win in your life. He's going to bring you victory in your life. But you first have to come to the end of your own sufficiency. You got to be willing to embrace weakness so that God can be strong in you. I hope that you would think about this, meditate on it, and ask yourself the question, am I still functioning in my self-sufficiency and what I consider my own strengths and my own abilities? And am I trying to manipulate the circumstances of my life to have it go the way I want it to go? Or am I surrendered? Am I willing to go to the mat with God and wrestle with him and let him prevail on me in such a way that enables me to prevail? This is God's will for us in Jesus. Christ went to the cross, submitted himself to pain and suffering and sorrow and brokenness on our behalf that we might have life. And that life comes through us also surrendering ourselves so that God can fill us.